The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison adjusted his scope for the third time. His SEAL team had been tracking a high-value target for 6 days through some of the most dangerous terrain in the region. The intelligence was solid, but something felt different about this mission. The local villagers spoke in hushed whispers about a ghost that protected these mountains, a legend they called Falcon. Morrison had heard countless stories during his 12 years in special operations, but this one stuck with him. According to the locals, Falcon was neither friend nor enemy to anyone. He was a shadow that moved through the mountains like wind, appearing only when the balance of power shifted too far in any direction. Some said he was a former soldier gone rogue. Others claimed he was a local fighter who had lost everything to war. Nobody knew his real name or where he came from. The team's target was Colonel Hassan Malik, a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. Intelligence suggested Malik was hiding in a compound 2 clicks north of their current position. The mission seemed straightforward enough, but Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Sergeant First Class Danny Rodriguez, the team's sniper, lowered his rifle and looked toward Morrison. "Sir," movement on the ridgeline. Single figure, approximately 800 meters northeast. His voice was barely a whisper through the comm system. Morrison turned his binoculars toward the indicated position. Through the heat shimmer, he could make out a lone figure standing motionless on the rocky outcrop. The person appeared to be observing their position, but made no aggressive moves. "Can you get a clear look at him?" "Negative, sir. Too much distance and heat distortion. But he's been there for about 10 minutes now, just watching." The rest of the team maintained their positions while Morrison considered their options. They were already behind schedule, and any delay could compromise the entire operation. But something about this mysterious observer bothered him. In his experience, locals who spotted military operations either fled immediately or tried to warn the targets. This person was doing neither. "Rodriguez, keep eyes on our friend up there. Everyone else, we stick to the plan. We move out in 5 minutes." As they prepared to advance, Morrison noticed the figure on the ridge had vanished. No movement, no sound, just gone. Rodriguez confirmed through his scope that the position was empty. It was as if the person had simply melted into the rocky landscape. The team moved carefully through a narrow valley that would take them to their objective. The terrain was treacherous, with loose rocks and steep drop-offs on both sides. Morrison had chosen this route because it offered the best cover, but it also limited their escape options if things went wrong. 20 minutes into their advance, Rodriguez suddenly raised his fist, signaling the team to halt. Through his earpiece, Morrison heard the sniper's urgent whisper. "Movement ahead. Multiple contacts. Looks like an ambush position." Morrison crawled forward to get a better view. Through his scope, he could see at least 6 fighters positioned along the valley walls above them. They were well concealed and clearly waiting for the SEAL team to walk into their trap. Someone had warned them. "How did they know our route?" whispered Petty Officer Mike Chun, the team's communications specialist. Before Morrison could respond, a new voice came through their comms. The voice was calm, measured, and spoke perfect English with no discernible accent. "SEAL team, you are walking into an ambush. 6 shooters on the high ground, 2 more flanking from behind. Suggest immediate withdrawal to grid reference 41, RQR 1234-5678. The team froze. Their communications were encrypted and frequency hopping. No one should have been able to break into their channel, let alone provide tactical information. "Who is this?" Morrison demanded into his microphone. "Someone who prefers to keep the playing field level. You have 30 seconds before they realize you've stopped advancing." Morrison had to make a split-second decision. Trust an unknown voice on their supposedly secure channel, or continue with a mission that was clearly compromised. His training told him to abort, but his gut told him this mysterious contact was trying to help them. "Team, fall back to the suggested grid reference. Move fast and quiet." They retreated carefully, using every bit of cover available. As they reached the coordinates provided by their unknown helper, Morrison realized they were in a defensible position with multiple escape routes. Whoever had guided them here understood tactics and terrain. From their new position, they watched as the ambush site erupted in confusion. The Taliban fighters had realized their targets weren't coming and began arguing among themselves. Through his scope, Morrison counted 8 fighters total, more than their mysterious contact had indicated. SEAL Team, this is Falcon. Morrison's blood ran cold. The legend the villagers whispered about was real, and somehow he was talking to them. Falcon, how are you on our frequency? That's not important right now. Your target, Colonel Malik, is not in the compound you were heading to. He moved locations 2 hours ago. He's currently in a small house 1 kilometer east of your original objective. How do you know this? Because I've been tracking him longer than you have. Rodriguez's voice cut through the comms. Sir, I've got eyes on the new location. Single-story building, mud brick construction. Definitely has security, but lighter than what we expected at the original site. Morrison studied the intelligence they had been given. Everything about this mission had been planned based on Malik being in the northern compound. If Falcon was right, they were chasing shadows while their real target slipped away. Falcon, what's your interest in Malik? There was a long pause before the answer came. Let's just say I have unfinished business. Morrison weighed his options. Trust the ghost who somehow knew their mission details and could break their encryption or proceed with what was obviously compromised intelligence. The decision went against everything in his training manual, but his instincts told him Falcon was legitimate. Can you provide overwatch while we move to the new location? Negative. I work alone, but I can give you current intel on his security disposition and the best approach route. For the next 10 minutes, Falcon provided detailed information about guard positions, patrol patterns, and structural weak points of Malik's new hiding place. The intelligence was more detailed and current than anything their mission briefing had contained. As they prepared to move toward the new target, Morrison couldn't help but wonder who this mysterious figure really was. How did he know so much about their mission? How had he been tracking Malik independently? And, most importantly, could they trust him? The team moved out under the cover of gathering dusk. As they approached the new location, everything Falcon had told them proved accurate. The guard positions were exactly where he said they would be. The patrol patterns matched his description perfectly. Either Falcon was exactly who he claimed to be, or they were walking into the most elaborate trap in military history. Rodriguez took position on a small hill overlooking the target building. Chun established communications with base camp, though Morrison decided not to report their new source of intelligence just yet. The rest of the team prepared for a direct assault on the building. Falcon, we're in position. Any last-minute changes to the security situation? 2 guards just rotated out. You have a 5-minute window before the next shift change. Move now. Morrison signaled his team, and they advanced on the target building. Everything unfolded exactly as Falcon had predicted. They reached the building without being detected, neutralized the exterior security, and breached the main entrance. Inside, they found Colonel Malik exactly where Falcon said he would be, along with several important documents and communication equipment. The mission was a complete success, but Morrison knew they had succeeded only because of help from someone who shouldn't exist. As they prepared to extract with their prisoner, Morrison tried one more time to contact Falcon. Falcon, we have the package. Thanks for your assistance. Silence. Falcon, do you copy? Still nothing. Rodriguez's voice came through the comms as they moved toward their extraction point. Sir, I got movement on the ridgeline again. Same position as before. Morrison looked through his binoculars and saw the lone figure standing motionless on the rocky outcrop, just as they had hours earlier. Even from this distance, he could tell the person was watching their extraction. Then, just like before, the figure simply vanished. During the helicopter ride back to base, Morrison stared out at the Afghan landscape and wondered if he would ever see Falcon again. He had no idea that this encounter was just the beginning, and that the mysterious figure would soon become either their greatest asset or their most dangerous enemy. 3 weeks after the Malik mission, Morrison found himself back in the same region of Afghanistan, but this time the situation was completely different. Intelligence had picked up chatter about a massive Taliban operation plan for the following week. Multiple cells were converging on a small valley town called Koster, where a group of aid workers had been building a school and medical clinic. The mission briefing painted a grim picture. 43 international aid workers, including 12 Americans, were trapped in the town with no way to evacuate. The Taliban forces gathering in the area numbered over 200 fighters, far too many for Morrison's 8-man team to handle in a direct confrontation. Their orders were clear, but seemingly impossible. Extract the aid workers before the Taliban could use them as bargaining chips or worse. Morrison studied the satellite images of Koster with growing concern. The town sat in a bowl-shaped valley, surrounded by high ridges on all sides. There were only 3 roads leading in or out, and intelligence suggested all 3 were already being watched by Taliban scouts. Any rescue attempt would be spotted long before they could reach the aid workers. "This is a suicide mission," muttered Staff Sergeant Kevin Walsh, the team's demolitions expert, as he looked over Morrison's shoulder at the photos. "Even if we get in, how do we get 43 civilians out without air support?" Morrison knew Walsh was right. Command had made it clear that airstrikes were off the table because of the civilian population in the surrounding area. The politicians back home were terrified of another public relations disaster involving collateral damage. That left Morrison's team to figure out how to accomplish the impossible with minimal resources. As they prepared for insertion, Morrison found himself hoping that Falcon might appear again. During the debriefing after the Malik mission, he had mentioned their mysterious helper to his commanding officer, but the report had been classified and filed away. Officially, Falcon didn't exist. Unofficially, Morrison couldn't stop thinking about how the Ghost Warrior might be their only chance of success. The team inserted by helicopter 15 kilometers from the target town under cover of darkness. The plan was to move on foot through the mountains, establish an observation post overlooking Koster, and develop a rescue plan based on what they found. It wasn't much of a strategy, but it was all they had. The trek through the mountain terrain was grueling. Unlike their previous mission, this time they were carrying extra supplies for a potentially extended operation. Each man carried enough food and water for 5 days, additional medical supplies for treating wounded civilians, and extra ammunition for what was likely to be a running firefight during extraction. Rodriguez, once again serving as the team's scout, led them through a series of narrow mountain passes that would keep them hidden from Taliban patrols. The route added several hours to their journey, but it was their best chance of reaching the town undetected. As dawn broke on their second day of movement, they finally reached a ridge overlooking Koster. Through their scopes, they could see the small town spread out below them. The aid workers' compound was clearly visible in the center of town, surrounded by a low wall that would provide minimal protection against a determined assault. More concerning was what they could see around the town's perimeter. Taliban fighters had established checkpoints on all 3 access roads. Morrison counted at least 30 vehicles, which suggested a force of over 150 men already in position, with more arriving throughout the day. "Sir, this keeps getting worse," Chin reported after monitoring radio communications. "I'm picking up chatter indicating they're planning to move on the compound tonight. They want to take the aid workers before any rescue attempt can be organized." Morrison felt the weight of impossible decisions pressing down on him. 43 innocent people were going to die or disappear into Taliban captivity within hours, and his small team was powerless to stop it. He was about to contact base camp to request emergency air support. Consequences be damned, when a familiar voice came through their communications. "SEAL Team, this is Falcon. I understand you have a problem in Koster." Morrison's heart rate spiked. "Falcon, how are you monitoring our comms again?" "That's still not the important question. The important question is whether you want to save those aid workers or watch them become casualties of politics." "Of course we want to save them, but we're outnumbered 20-1 down there. Not if you're willing to trust me again." Morrison looked at his team members. Each man was a seasoned warrior, but they all understood the mathematics of their situation. 8 operators, no matter how skilled, couldn't fight their way through 200 Taliban fighters and extract 43 civilians. What did you have in mind, Falcon? Meet me at grid reference 41, our QR 2468 1357 at 1,400 hours. Come alone. Morrison checked his GPS. The coordinates were for a location about 2 kilometers from their current position, in a small canyon that would provide cover from observation. My team doesn't leave anyone behind, Falcon. If I go, they go. This isn't negotiation. You want to save those people, you meet me alone. Your team can provide overwatch from distance, but this conversation happens between you and me. Morrison considered his options. Everything about military protocol said not to trust an unknown contact, especially one who consistently demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't exist. But everything about their current situation said that following protocol would result in 43 dead civilians. Rodriguez, Chun, establish overwatch positions covering the meeting site. Walsh, take the rest of the team and scout for alternate extraction routes. I'm going to talk to our ghost. The hike to the meeting coordinates took Morrison through some of the most beautiful and deadly terrain he had ever seen. High mountain peaks surrounded the narrow canyon, creating perfect positions for snipers or ambush teams. He moved carefully, knowing that Rodriguez was watching through his scope from a distant ridge, but also knowing that if Falcon wanted him dead, the sniper coverage wouldn't matter. He reached the designated coordinates at exactly 1,400 hours and found himself in a small clearing surrounded by huge boulders. For several minutes, nothing happened. Morrison began to wonder if this was all an elaborate trap when a voice spoke from directly behind him. "You're punctual. That's good." Morrison spun around to see a man emerging from what he would have sworn was solid rock. Falcon appeared to be in his early 40s, with weathered features and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He was dressed in local clothing, but moved with the fluid precision of someone with extensive military training. "How did you get behind you without being seen?" "Practice. Lots of practice." Falcon gestured toward a flat rock that could serve as a seat. "Sit down, Commander. We have things to discuss." Morrison remained standing. "Who are you?" "Really, I'm someone who's been fighting in these mountains longer than your war has existed. I'm someone who understands that sometimes the only way to protect innocent people is to work outside the system." "That doesn't answer my question." Falcon smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "My name is David Clark, Master Sergeant, United States Army Special Forces. Officially killed in action 3 years ago during a classified operation in this region." Morrison felt his world shift. A dead American Special Forces soldier who had somehow become a ghost warrior in the Afghan mountains. The implications were staggering. "How are you still alive? Why didn't you come home?" "Because the mission that supposedly killed me was a setup. My unit was betrayed by someone in our chain of command. Someone who was feeding information to the Taliban in exchange for opium trafficking routes. 5 good men died because of that betrayal. I survived, but I was presumed dead, and that suited my purposes." The pieces began falling into place for Morrison. Falcon's detailed knowledge of American military procedures, his ability to hack their communications, his intimate knowledge of Taliban operations in the region. "You've been hunting the people responsible, among other things. But right now, I'm more interested in keeping those aid workers alive. And I have a plan that might work, but it requires your team to trust me completely." Morrison studied Clark's face, looking for signs of deception or instability. What he saw instead was a man who had been pushed beyond his breaking point, but had somehow forged himself into something harder and more focused than before. "Tell me your plan." "The Taliban are expecting a rescue attempt from the outside. They're not expecting an attack from within the town itself. There's an old Soviet-era tunnel system beneath Koster that connects to the aid workers' compound. The Taliban don't know about it because it's not on any map, but I've been using those tunnels for intelligence gathering for the past 6 months." Morrison's tactical mind began working. "You want us to infiltrate through the tunnels?" "Not us. Me. I go in alone, neutralize the guards at the compound, and secure the aid workers in the tunnel system. Meanwhile, your team creates a diversion on the opposite side of town to draw the main Taliban force away from the compound area. That's insane. You'd be alone against, however, many fighters they have inside the town. I've been alone against them for 3 years, Commander. I know how to move through this terrain without being seen, and I know their tactics better than they do. Morrison shook his head. My orders are to extract those civilians. I can't just turn them over to someone who's supposed to be dead. Then, modify the plan. Once I secure the aid workers in the tunnels, I'll guide them to a rally point outside town where your team can take over. You get the credit, they get to live, and I fade back into the mountains. The plan was risky beyond belief, but it was also the first thing Morrison had heard that had even a remote chance of success. How do I know you won't just disappear with 43 hostages? Clark stood and walked toward the edge of the clearing. Because, Commander, I may have become a ghost, but I'm still an American soldier. And American soldiers don't abandon civilians to die when they have the power to save them. With that, Clark melted back into the rocky landscape, leaving Morrison alone with an impossible decision. Trust a dead man's plan to save 43 lives, or watch helplessly as innocent people died because he followed proper protocol. Morrison activated his radio. Team, return to base position. We're going to try something that will either be brilliant or get us all killed. As he made his way back to rejoin his team, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that whatever happened in the next 24 hours would change everything, not just for the mission, but for his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior in an impossible war. The sun was setting behind the mountains as Morrison briefed his team on Clark's proposal. Tomorrow would bring either salvation or catastrophe for 43 innocent people trapped in a town that was about to become a battlefield. The assault on Costair began at 0300 hours, just as the mountain air turned coldest and the Taliban sentries would be fighting sleep. Morrison's team had split into 2 elements. Rodriguez and Chin established sniper positions on the eastern ridge to provide covering fire, while Morrison, Walsh, and the remaining team members prepared to create the diversion that would draw enemy forces away from the aid compound. Clark had been right about the tunnel system. Using coordinates he provided, Morrison's team had located the hidden entrance carved into a rocky outcrop 2 kilometers north of the town. The tunnel was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and descended steeply into complete darkness. Morrison had a trust that somewhere in that underground maze, a supposedly dead soldier was moving toward 43 innocent people who had no idea their lives hung in the balance. Falcon, this is Morrison. We're in position to begin the diversion. What's your status? Clark's voice came through crystal clear, though he spoke in barely a whisper. I'm in the tunnel system beneath the compound. I count 8 guards around the perimeter, 2 more inside the main building. The hostages are being held in what looks like a classroom on the ground floor. Morrison checked his watch. According to their plan, they had exactly 12 minutes to draw the Taliban fighters away from the compound area. After that, Clark would have to move whether the diversion worked or not, because the aid workers were scheduled to be transferred to a more secure location at dawn. Beginning diversion in 60 seconds. Good hunting, Falcon. Morrison signaled Walsh, who had rigged several small explosive charges around an abandoned building on the opposite side of town. The plan was to make the Taliban think they were under attack by a much larger force, hopefully drawing most of their fighters away from the aid compound to investigate. The first explosion lit up the night sky with a brilliant orange flash. Walsh had used just enough C4 to collapse one wall of the building while making maximum noise. Within seconds, shouts echoed across the valley as Taliban fighters began moving toward the explosion. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the comm system. Multiple vehicles moving toward your position. Looks like the diversion is working. Morrison watched through his night vision scope as pickup trucks loaded with fighters raced through the narrow streets toward the disturbance. But he also noticed that several guards remained around the aid compound, exactly as Clark had predicted. Falcon, you've got a window. Most of the reaction force is heading our way, but you still have local security to deal with. Copy. Moving now. 3 blocks away, Clark emerged from a concealed tunnel entrance directly beneath the aid workers' compound. He had spent months mapping this underground network, learning every passage and hiding spot. The Soviets had built these tunnels during their occupation in the 1980s, intending them as storage and communication routes. Now, they served a very different purpose. Clark moved through the darkness with practiced silence. His years of operating alone in hostile territory had taught him to become invisible, to flow through enemy positions like smoke. He reached the basement of the compound building and paused to listen for movement above. Through the floorboards, he could hear muffled voices speaking in English. The aid workers were still alive, though he could detect fear and exhaustion in their whispered conversations. He could also hear Taliban guards moving around on the ground floor, their heavy boots creating distinct patterns of sound that told him their positions. Using a small fiber optic camera, Clark peered through a crack in the basement ceiling to assess the situation above. The aid workers were indeed being held in a large classroom, with 2 armed guards standing near the doorway. Through the windows, he could see the silhouettes of external guards patrolling the compound perimeter. Clark moved to a position directly beneath the classroom and carefully removed a loose floorboard he had identified during his reconnaissance. He found himself looking up into a supply closet adjacent to where the hostages were being held. Perfect. Meanwhile, Morrison's diversion was creating exactly the chaos they needed. Walsh triggered a second explosion, this one closer to the Taliban's main staging area, and the response was immediate. Radio chatter intercepted by Chun indicated that the enemy commanders thought they were under attack by a full platoon of American forces. "Sir, they're moving more fighters toward your position," Rodriguez reported. "But I'm still showing guards around the aid compound." Morrison acknowledged the report while preparing for the inevitable moment when the Taliban realized the explosions were a trick. Once that happened, they would have minutes at most before enemy fighters returned to the compound in overwhelming numbers. Inside the supply closet, Clark listened carefully to the conversation in the adjacent room. One of the guards was arguing with someone on a radio, probably receiving orders about the explosions on the other side of town. This was his chance. Clark eased the closet door open just enough to see into the classroom. 43 aid workers sat on the floor in the center of the room, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. 2 Taliban fighters stood near the main entrance, their attention focused on the radio conversation. Both guards had their weapons slung rather than ready, a tactical mistake that was about to cost them everything. Clark moved like lightning. His knife found the first guard's throat before the man could make a sound. The second guard started to turn at the sound of his partner falling, but Clark was already there, wrapping his arm around the guard's neck and applying pressure to the carotid artery. The man went limp within seconds. The aid workers stared in shock as this apparition in local clothing emerged for what they had thought was an empty closet. Clark quickly moved among them, cutting their restraints with efficient precision. "I'm an American soldier," he whispered urgently. "We're getting you out of here, but you need to follow my instructions exactly. No talking, no noise, and stay low." Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who seemed to be the senior member of the group, nodded grimly. "How many of you are there?" "Enough," Clark replied, which was both true and misleading. "Follow me to the basement. We're going underground." As the aid workers began moving toward the basement stairs, explosions echoed from across town where Morrison's team was maintaining their diversion. But Clark could also hear vehicles returning, their engines growing louder as Taliban fighters realized they had been tricked. "Morrison, I have the package. Beginning movement to Rally Point Alpha. You need to extract now." Morrison's response came back tense, but controlled. "Copy, Falcon. We've got company incoming. Multiple vehicles, maybe 30 fighters heading back your way." Clark ushered the last of the aid workers into the tunnel system and began leading them through the narrow passages he knew by heart. The civilians moved slowly in the complete darkness, guided only by Clark's whispered instructions and the occasional red glow of his filtered flashlight. Behind them, the compound erupted in angry shouts as Taliban fighters discovered their missing prisoners. Clark could hear boots pounding overhead as search teams spread through the building. It would only be minutes before someone thought to check the basement and discovered the tunnel entrance. The underground journey to the rally point took 25 agonizing minutes. The aid workers, weakened by days of captivity and poor food, struggled through passages that sometimes required crawling on hands and knees. Dr. Mitchell helped keep the group calm and moving, but Clark could sense their growing panic as explosions echoed through the tunnel system above them. Morrison's team was fighting a running battle through the mountain terrain, using hit-and-run tactics to stay ahead of the pursuing Taliban force. They had successfully drawn most of the enemy fighters away from the town, but the diversion couldn't last much longer. Falcon, we're 10 minutes from Rally Point Alpha. What's your ETA? Clark checked his GPS in the red glow of his flashlight. They were close, but the final stretch required climbing through a vertical shaft that would challenge even healthy individuals. 15 minutes, maybe 20. The package is secure, but moving slowly. Copy. We'll be there. The rally point was a small clearing in a side canyon 3 kilometers from Costair, chosen because it offered multiple escape routes and good defensive positions. Morrison's team reached it first and immediately established a perimeter while monitoring radio traffic that indicated the Taliban was organizing a massive search operation. Clark emerged from the tunnel system with the 43 aid workers just as the first hints of dawn appeared over the mountain peaks. The civilians were exhausted, frightened, and some were injured from the difficult underground journey, but they were alive and free. Dr. Mitchell approached Morrison as his team began providing medical attention to those who needed it. That man saved our lives, she said, looking around for Clark. Where did he go? Morrison turned to look for their mysterious ally and realized that Falcon had vanished once again. Somewhere between emerging from the tunnels and the brief chaos of getting everyone to safety, David Clark had melted back into the landscape like a ghost. Sir, incoming transmission, Chen reported. It's Falcon. Morrison grabbed the radio. Falcon, where are you? My job is done, Commander. Get those people home safely. Wait, we need to debrief this mission. Command is going to want to know how 8 SEALs rescued 43 hostages from 200 Taliban fighters. Tell them you had good intelligence and better luck. Don't mention me. Morrison looked around at the aid workers who were now safe because a dead man had chosen to honor his oath to protect innocent life. Falcon, come with us. You've earned the right to go home. There was a long pause before Clark's final transmission. I am home, Commander. These mountains, this war, this is where I belong now. But maybe someday our paths will cross again. The radio went silent, leaving Morrison with 43 rescued civilians, an impossible mission success, and a story that no one would believe. 6 hours later, as helicopters carried the aid workers to safety and Morrison's team prepared their after-action report, Rodriguez spotted a lone figure standing on a distant ridge. Through his sniper scope, he could see the man clearly for just a moment before he disappeared into the rocky terrain. Think we'll see him again, sir? Rodriguez asked. Morrison looked out at the Afghan mountains where legends were born and warriors became ghosts. I hope so, Rodriguez. I really hope so. 3 days later, Morrison received a classified message through official channels. It contained detailed intelligence about Taliban operations throughout the region, including the location of several high-value targets and information about weapons smuggling routes. The message was unsigned, but Morrison knew who had sent it. In the mountains of Afghanistan, the legend of Falcon continued to grow. Village elders spoke of a guardian spirit who protected the innocent and punished those who brought violence to peaceful people. Taliban fighters whispered fearful stories about a ghost warrior who could appear anywhere and disappear without a trace. But Morrison knew the truth. Falcon wasn't a legend or a spirit. He was Master Sergeant David Clark, a soldier who had died in an ambush 3 years ago and been reborn as something harder, more focused, and completely dedicated to a war that existed outside the boundaries of politics and official missions. As Morrison's team flew back to their forward operating base, he couldn't shake the feeling that their encounters with Falcon were far from over. In a war where the lines between friend and enemy shifted like desert sand, having a guardian angel in the mountains might be the difference between success and catastrophe. The legend of Falcon had been discovered by the SEALs, but Morrison suspected they had only scratched the surface of who David Clark had become and what he was capable of. In the deadly game of asymmetric warfare in the Afghan mountains, having a player who knew all the rules and wasn't bound by any of them might be the most valuable asset of all. The war would continue, as it had for generations in these ancient mountains. But now it included a new element, a ghost warrior who answered to no flag, but served a higher calling that transcended politics and nationality. The legend of Falcon had begun, and Morrison knew that this was only the beginning of the story.